One side of the coin, which is the rise of an intellectual tradition in Islamic civilization. The other side of it, which we need to know about, is how this was transmitted to Europe. We don't quite know when it starts, but it seems that a certain Gerbert of Aurillac set this very important ball rolling. Gerbert of Aurillac, which I think is in Aurillac, it's in Burgundy, is it? Anyway, he later becomes a pope. He becomes Pope Sylvester II, dies in 1003. And he certainly has a smattering of the Saracenic learning. How he comes by it, we don't quite know. There's a traditional story that claims that he travelled to Cordoba, where he studied the Arab sciences under a Muslim teacher, and then seduced his teacher's daughter, who, in return for services rendered, actually gave him her father's books, and he smuggled them back to Europe. No real evidence for that rather unpapal sort of legend. And it's more probable that Gerbert became acquainted with Arabic learning when reading in a monastery library in Catalonia, which was the first deeply Arabized area of the Islamic world to fall under the Christian Reconquista. Gerbert was a bright, interested sort of person. He liked constructing astronomical models, and he was probably the first to at least be aware of the Arabic numerals in Christendom, although Fibonacci brought them in a thoroughgoing way. But he doesn't seem to have triggered a tradition. His interest in the Arabs really died with him. In the 11th century, there's a few other scholars who are interested in Arabic astronomy in particular, and that triggers the beginning of astronomy in Northern Europe. In the field of medicine, there is a more substantial conduit for the introduction of the Arab learning in the form of the medical college at Salerno in southern Italy, again an area that had been under Muslim rule for a while. And a Jewish physician, the Jews, of course, some of the great physicians of the Middle Ages, you think of Maimonides. Donolo was a Jewish scholar who wrote a few medical treatises in Latin for this school in Salerno based on his studies in the Muslim world. These are probably the first manifestation of Islamic medicine in Christendom. This is in the 11th century. These early efforts superseded when in 1085 the first big Muslim city, Toledo, is captured by the Reconquista. Formerly a mainly Muslim and Jewish city, this becomes a center of translation, rather as Baghdad had been for the Muslims 2 centuries earlier, although on a much smaller scale.
Yes, by the way, Salerno has the oldest medicine school in the Amalfi Coast. I visited it. They had the prince who had the oldest center of studying medicine in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct, yeah. Largely through this man Donolo and other early mediators. So Toledo becomes important, and a number of monkish translators, chief amongst whom was somebody called Domenico Jundi-shapur. I don't know which order he would have belonged to. This must be before the Dominicans, so I don't know. But anyway, Jundi-shapur studies these texts. He has 2 assistants. One of them is a convert to Christianity from Judaism and seems to have been fluent in Arabic. And typically this was the way in which these translations from Arabic to Latin worked. He would have a 2-man team, one of whom would translate a kind of raw translation from Arabic into a kind of Latin, and then a more polished, accurate version would be provided by his colleague. Another significant figure was called Gerard of Cremona, who died in, I think, 1187 and bequeathed around 100 translations of Arabic works. There were also a few translations made under Latin rule in Palestine. One of the figures here was an Englishman called Adelard of Bath, who travelled to Syria and actually learnt mathematics under Arabic teachers. And he ends up translating Khwarizmi's main work into Latin, and also the elements of Euclid, which wasn't known in the Greek original and came to Europe through Arabic translations. So by the 13th century, largely due to these translations, the intellectual climate in Europe had become a lot more sophisticated. And in the 13th century, you have, again, slightly maverick, strange figures like Michael the Scot, who was regarded by his contemporary as a kind of occult magician. And in fact, in Dante's Inferno, he's presented as a kind of wizard. But he did study under some Arab teachers in Spain, went to Toledo, and then found employment at the court of the famous maverick Emperor Frederick II in Palermo in Sicily. And under his patronage made a number of important translations. And he seems to have been the first to have translated from the Arabic the philosophical works of Aristotle, along with commentaries by Ibn Rushd. Another important enlightened figure from the 13th century is Alfonso el Sabio of Spain. If you ever go to Cordoba and you visit a museum which is in a tower called the Calahorra, which is on the banks of Guadalquivir, which is a museum founded by the French Muslim convert Roger Garaudy in order to indicate the transmission of Arab knowledge to medieval Europe through Cordoba. One of the strange experiences in this very high-tech, up-to-date museum is that you go into a darkened space and suddenly in front of you appear life-size waxworks of 4 major figures of the city. And they each speak to you through your headphones. And disconcertingly, they speak, if you've got the English translation, in a particularly archaic sort of old Etonian accent. But anyway, Ibn Arabi, who's the great mystic of Cordoba, is there for a while, speaks and explains his vision of mystical discovery of God. Next to him is Averroes, contemporary of Ibn Arabi, who talks about his rationalizing view of discovering truth from first principles. You also get Maimonides, Musa ben Maimon, the great Arabized Jewish thinker of the city, who ends up in Egypt in Saladin's entourage, and who is basically part of the Kalam tradition. There's something called Jewish Kalam. He's a Kalam theologian, but using a Jewish set of religious assumptions. And the fourth figure is Don Alfonso el Sabio, who in the teeth of opposition from the church actually patronizes translations and also allows the continued practice of Islam for a while in Cordoba. I think he's actually excommunicated for that, or he actually gets into very serious trouble. But anyway, he's an enlightened exception to the often rather depressing story of the Reconquista. Another channel of cultural transmission is the very large Jewish minorities. Spanish Jews had generally enjoyed very good relations with the caliphs in Cordoba, partly because they were the ones who'd helped the Arab invaders in the first place. They invited Tariq bin Ziyad because they'd been oppressed by the Visigothic rulers. And a lot of them had studied under Arab scientists and philosophers. And although generally they expressed their philosophical and theological discussions in Arabic, it's actually in Spain that medieval Hebrew becomes one of the world's great philosophical languages through the incorporation of substantial Arabic philosophical terminology. Now, I have to stop very soon, but the final figure we should be aware of in this story is somebody called Peter the Venerable, who spent some time in Toledo, and he's interesting because he's not just concerned with the philosophical Hellenistic translations or with medical or astronomical works, but he really wants to know about Islam. Obviously, for polemical reasons, he wants to refute it. He's involved in the beginnings of the Inquisition and the public debates that were taking place, usually rather staged debates between, by this time, usually Dominican friars and Jewish or Muslim opponents. And he sponsors translations of a corpus of Islamic texts that become known as the Cluniac corpus, because he's attached to the great monastery at Cluny. And I think there's only about 9 books in this corpus, but they include a kind of translation of the Quran into Latin, an early Christian Arabic historian of the rise of Islam, which contains some basic accurate information, and some theological texts. And this really becomes the almost exclusive source of European awareness of the Islamic religion in the West, really until the 17th or the 18th century, when translations start up again with people like Edward Pocock, the first Laudian professor of Arabic at Oxford, and also the beginning of Arabic studies at the Sorbonne. So that basically is the crude, broad outlines of what I think is one of the most important, possibly most important, processes of intellectual cultural transmission in world history. I think one can make that dramatic claim for it. And just to end with the point that I tried to make at the beginning, this is the European view of what it's about. But of course, in the Islamic world, one could quite easily talk about the Turkish philosophers. The Tahafut-Al-Falasifah debate didn't end with Ghazali, but the Ottoman Turks wrote about 6 or 7 works with the same title until as late as the 18th century. And the continued vitality of Turkish intellectual life has been shown by the American scholar Victoria Holbrook in her work on 18th century Mevlevi, Sufi, philosophical traditions and poetry. So this is one story, but it's wrong to see it as a straight line. It's part of a family tree that sometimes diverges quite definitively, sometimes converges, often becomes quite incestuous, if you like. The idea that there was a cultural iron curtain separating medieval Christendom from Islam is actually completely false. The boundaries were very permeable, usually in one direction, because the Arabs were, for a number of reasons, in a privileged intellectual position. But of course, with the rise of the Renaissance, the boot becomes on the other foot, and the Arab world, following Napoleon's invasion of Egypt at the end of the 18th century, starts to try and catch up from a European perspective, and European philosophy and science start to be integrated into the Islamic world, with consequences whose long-term implications are still probably difficult to discern.